Okay, folks, we're on the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. It looks like we're continuing to get excellent participation, which is terrific in any reading group because we get a nice diversity of views. Um, this month, we're going to be talking about the longest title in the series, Casanova's Chinese Restaurant, which if anyone has some insights on why Pohl picked that title in particular, we'll get into that in the discussion, since it really isn't sort of the centerpiece of this particular novel. But let me just start with a few slides to kind of acquaint where we are. So this is volume 5, and at this point, it's quite clear, particularly with if you look at the reviews, people started to catch on that this not only was going to be a series, but was going to be a big series. And I think at this point, particularly with some of the pieces that got published, coincident, they weren't. It went beyond the typical book review that one saw with previous volumes. So in terms of time frame, we're right smack in the mid to late 30s. Of course, the abdication crisis is sort of in a backdrop in the last chapter of the book in particular. Um, but in terms of the coverage, in the New Statesman, V.S. Pritchett published a lengthy essay on the series, not just focusing on Casanova's Chinese Restaurant. Jocelyn Brooke, who was an acquaintance of Pohl's, wrote a long piece of about 8 pages in the London Magazine. And of course, one that I shared with you is from the Spectator. Evelyn Waugh had his sort of begrudging comments about this series. It wasn't an enthusiastic review, although he sort of had some admiration because, among other things, at this point, Pohl had surpassed Waugh's own trilogy in terms of length of a series. So he was clearly working on a larger scale than Waugh had attempted at any point. And it also, another piece that I shared, it kind of the first profile interview of Pohl out of the Daily Mail. So it was a little bit snarky in its title, but also a question I think a lot of Pohl readers continue to ask as they encounter him is is he a genius, or is he a snob, or is he a bit of both, which may be the right answer. I've been preparing a class on The Great Gatsby and doing some research. And F. Scott Fitzgerald was one of the writers that Pohl not only, of course, met in Hollywood, but sort of admired and learned from. And in a piece that appeared in a book called The Liberal Imagination by Lionel Trilling, a U.S. critic, this book appeared around 1950. He has an essay about Fitzgerald, but I like this comment in particular because I think it captures one of the qualities of Pohl's work, where he says in Fitzgerald's work, but we might say the same thing about Pohl, we hear in it at once the tenderness towards human desire that modifies a true firmness of moral judgment. It is, I would venture to say, the normal or ideal voice of the novelist. And that's certainly one of the things that characterizes Pohl is his reluctance to take judgments on at least through the voice of Nick Jenkins in this series. However, I have to say, I did want to mention one thing that I find about this book that strikes me in particular about the almost utter passivity and uninvolvement of Nick Jenkins as a character in this novel is this line that happens towards the end. I think this is the end of chapter 4. Uh, Almost equally unexpected. So he mentions that Moreland and Matilda get married And then he
Oh.
says, almost equally unexpectedly, I found myself married. And seriously, any of us who are married would never in a million years say, I found myself married. I found myself married is what someone says if they wake up the morning after a bender and they found that. I mean, this happened in New York City a lot in the 20s during the jazz age, that people would get rip snorting drunk, drive up to a justice of peace outside the city and get married. And actually, the woman that I wrote a biography about, which is going to be published next year, Virginia Faulkner, she got so blind drunk that she woke up and found that she had gotten married in a drunken stupor. That's unexpectedly, I found myself married. But in terms of an actual relationship, it's almost. I just had to comment on that because it's so strikingly the opposite of what like any normal human would say about getting married. And I also mention that because it's clear that one of the sort of themes of this book is marriage, because we certainly see a number of, say, successful and unsuccessful models of relationships, marriages. So the most tempestuous is, of course, McClintock and Hilda's. Moreland's and Matilda's gets going in this book. Of course, Nick and Isabel, which is sort of more of a backdrop. Buster and Mrs. Fox, and maybe Norman Chandler is a sort of a creative way to find a way to get go forward in a marriage. One might suggest that Charles Stringan and Miss Whedon are, in a way, a couple of their own sort, certainly more successful in some ways than Charles's own marriage to Peggy Stepney. And then finally, in the background of all this, we have this big historical issue of the marriage of Edward and Wallace Simpson. So with that, I'll open it up for discussion. We don't have a special guest this week, but I'm sure, as usual, we'll have plenty of things that folks want to contribute. Didn't Britney Spears
Brad,
find herself unexpectedly married? I have to confess almost total ignorance when it comes to issues big Britney Spears related. I defer to anybody who might know something about that one. Uh,
Brad, may I
yes,
speak?
yes,
Um,
absolutely.
I perhaps you've mentioned it before, but uh, Paul did say that he read The Great Gatsby every year. It was truly a book that he admired, and this being the 100th anniversary of Gatsby, a lot of people have reread it. But if you read it, channeling Poe, there are just so many similarities between the two Nicks that you have to think that there's quite a strong overlay, even though the books are utterly different. And Gatsby, in the end, is a melodrama, very poignant one, and so on. And lots of things, bad things happen, and violence, and so on, which is utterly unlike Poe. But there are still many similarities.
That's true. I mean, I mean, it becomes clear that there are parallels, but I think it's one of those topics that's a great topic for discussion because there are certainly ways, these similarities. Nick Carraway, because he is in both cases, the Nick is the narrator. We see everything in the story through Nick's eyes, so to speak. On the other hand, I think one contrast between Gatsby and the dance, at least, is that uh, Fitzgerald was very conscious and essentially not setting up the melodrama as really the center of his story. You know, he believed strongly that the issue was that his subject was really the American dream and that sort of historical context in which the rise of capitalism and corruption and all those other things that were going on in the jazz age. Whereas the contrast, history for Pohl is always in the background, right? it's almost never on center stage. So I think that's one way in which Pohl very deliberately said, no, I'm not, that's going on, but that's not going to be kind of the big message I'm going to carry through this series. Doris, you had a comment you wanted to share?
Yes. Is it a strength or a weakness to have Nick so reticent about his own marriage? He wasn't reticent about Jean Duport and his lusty feelings for her, but when Isabel is in the hospital after a miscarriage, first you see him at a family party where everyone's saying, "How's Isabel?" You don't know. And the most that they say to each other, I think she says, I want to go home. I'll be happy to be home. And he says, I'll be happy to have you there. I mean, it's very provocative for the reader, but I don't know. Do you think it's a strength or a weakness?
Extent I feel like it must mirror Pohl's own marriage, which seems to have been a very successful and compatible. And he just that was not the drama. So Nick's marriage was not, it's not. It's the backdrop, and it's almost as much of a backdrop as the events of history in the book, and maybe even more of that. So yeah, and Isabel is never really up front for more than a page or two throughout the entire series. Pete, you had something you wanted to offer?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it does in many ways mirror Pohl's actual marriage to Lady Violet. I mean, I can understand why he says, I found myself married. I mean, when you know the background, I mean, Pohl met Lady Violet in something like late August or early September, and they were married on the 1st of December. So it was it was a very quick romance, and he actually says somewhere that basically when they met, they started a conversation, and that's a conversation that went on for however many years it was, 60 odd years. And that's very much the relationship I think they had. I mean, I never met AP, so I never saw them in action together, but I did meet Lady Violet. And yeah, I can see that probably is the sort of that they had. And on the back of that, Lady Violet had an awful lot of influence and input into dance. A lot. I mean, everything. I mean, Powell admits this. He says this. That
Right.
The whole of dance was passed by Lady Violet, and her input was absolutely valuable to him.
Simon, let me get Simon and then Lesby.
Sorry about my big fingers. I'm on my phone, my laptop's not working. I was just going to back up Keith on that actually, and the lecture that Hilary Sperling gave in, he says, trying to guess the month, January 2024 at the Travellers Club was excellent, and I think Lady Violet had wanted more of her in inverted commas, as in Isabel in the novel, then there would be more of Isabel in the novel. So she wasn't quite saying that sections of it were struck out, but I think there's as Keith said, it was going through her hands, and she was making suggestions, keeping track of characters, trying to do some of the continuity. And the strong implication from what Hilary said was that actually it was a conscious decision by Pohl, or rather Pohl and Lady Violet, that the marriage was displayed in that way.
Thanks for that. Leslie? If you could unmute.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. This is sort of similar question of things that are oh, I thought I'd take that off. Lower hand. It's just things that are left out that you would somehow expect to be there in the novel, and the marriage is not there. You know, it's very much in the background. And the other thing that you don't see much is work. You know, in the previous volume, Nick is working in a film studio, and I think all you hear about it is the time that he's not actually going into the studio because there's some problem. I think, I don't know, some set of people working there are on strike, so they can't do anything. You know, so there's nothing there. Now he's on a different job. But it's not just him. Nobody is ever seen in kind of doing work. It's all, they're all seen in their kind of social relations. And you think this is a period when people are actually, you know, working, they're meeting people in working environments. I mean, as I say, he was working in a film studio. You'd thought there would be lots got out of that when he says all the literary young men were working in film studios at that time. But he doesn't mention, you know, he doesn't talk about them interacting in film studios. He talks about them interacting in, I mean, if there are any other characters who are working in film studios, he meets them in social circles. So, and there's a whole sense of things being peripheral to what he thinks is important, which is social interactions, which, you know, is a take, you know, it's a reasonable, you know, I mean, you also, you don't see the artists, the musicians, the artists actually composing or rehearsing musicians for their you know, which again some other writers would show them in the process of creation, or, you know, bringing things, you know, having exhibitions or whatever. So I think that's kind of, you know, it's interesting what he chose to put the spotlight on.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think let's acknowledge that work is one of most people's favorite subjects.
Yeah, and I mean, Freud
when people get
said,
together, they talk about their jobs.
Yeah,
and
I mean, and
hardly
Freud
anybody
said,
talks about their job
Yeah.
in this series. There's, in fact, if they
The only
do,
person
they
does
sort of
is-
denigrate it.
Yeah, the only person who does talk about it is Widmerpool.
Widmerpool, yes,
and he bangs on about the mysteries of finance. And other people are surely doing much more interesting things, but they're not talking about them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Judith, you had
yeah.
a comment?
Yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of things. The quote you put up about him being married and finding himself married unexpectedly. I think one of the things I thought in this whole sort of volume was that it was funny and that he was very dry at times, and that seemed to me to be part of that sort of almost wry humor. That distance of this is, you know, this is something that happens to me rather than a deliberate choice. Obviously it's a deliberate choice on his part, but the sort of the distancing of himself from any sort of emotional involvement. And to me that also ties into the reaction to Isabel losing the baby. And it seems to me that is in some ways probably quite a typical reaction of a man of Nick's class and generation, that you know, yes, it's upsetting, but it's kind of it's a woman's issue. And this is very much, it seems to me, there are lots of women in the book, but this is a man's view of this world. And that just struck me as the sort of the tying the things together of that distance from emotion. And in a way that's quite, it doesn't strike me as unusual for men of his class and generation.
No, absolutely true. I'm working on a book right now about the literature and the movies of the pre-code era, and it's amazing of all the sort of strictures that existed in Hollywood about what you could and couldn't show. The number one stricture was the word pregnancy or pregnant. it never appears in any of the movies, and in fact, the literally the same movie, the same story was filmed twice. There was a movie I think in 32, 33 called Life Begins, which takes place on a maternity ward as Loretta Young and some others, and then they filmed it again in 39 with a stronger participation by the woman who wrote the story in the first place. And that was like one of the very first movies in Hollywood that used the word pregnancy directly. And of course, we still know the stereotype of the husbands in the waiting room, wringing their hands and smoking and all of that, wondering what's going on in the mystery of the delivery ward. So yeah, I mean, it was quite classic that probably to many husbands, the whole question of delivery was pretty much a black
Yeah.
hole.
Well, I think that's, if you think about, there are no pictures of the Queen Elizabeth pregnant. And that, it was very much a thing that you did not show. And I think that's, very much that's, and perhaps more that sort of upper class thing, that it was something where it could be, separated off. There's some stuff in, Elizabeth Jane Howard in the Cazalet Chronicles, where one of the women has a baby who dies, is stillborn. And there again, it's very much kept away and separate. So
Right,
that one sort of fits in together.
right. Let's go to Frank and then Sally.
I believe that Anthony Powell's wife lost a number of pregnancies, and she was forcefully bedbound
That's
for the
right.
successful
During the
pregnancies.
war, the early period of the war, wasn't it not? While he was on service.
But the thing I want to say,
Yes,
sorry, please.
I seem to recall that she lost. Well, they had two children, Tristram and John. Tristram was born in 41, early in the war. And I think Lady Violet probably had quite a bad time with that pregnancy. John was born in 46. There was certainly, and my memory is that there was a miscarriage between Tristram and John, but there was also one before Tristram, just before the war.
Yeah, I think that jives with what I understand of his biography. Anything more, Frank, you wanted to mention on
So,
that?
but the conversation that Nick has very soon after he hears that Isabel's lost the baby, Morland comes up. He tells Morland, and Morland does not acknowledge it in any way. And then the doctor and Widmerpool come up, and again they find out about this, and neither of them mentions it, and they're just talking about the most tangential thing, and they offer him no condolences whatsoever, and it is absolutely heartbreaking.
Right, right. Well, and in fact, there's that little issue of the doctor using the term abortion for miscarriage, what we would call a miscarriage today. Sally, you had a comment?
Okay, that good?
Yes.
I wanted to add what Frank just said about Moreland and Nick and Widmerpool and the doctor. They're in that labyrinth. It's kind of like the old the hotel where his Uncle Giles stayed. He compares it to that, the Ufford, where the hallway is this dank, dark, under subterranean labyrinth, almost the underground. And it's four men talking about abortion, miscarriage, and the death of an imminent newborn dying. And I just thought that was the weirdest, strangest scene there. And it's very, when you go back and read it a couple of times, it strikes you more that it's just all men. And and it's the three stages going from, well, illegal abortion to a miscarriage that just happened and the imminent death. And it's very, but I think the fact that it's underground and subterranean and really lit, that's all part of the whole atmosphere.
Do you think that women are a foreign country to Powell?
I think yes, because he was a solitary male child. His father was always flying into rages and um, very intimidating. And then he was shipped off at a very young age to Eton, and so
Yeah.
he's surrounded by boys. And it's all, it really. I think you're right.
Well, yeah, right there in that, that first chapter of the book, or the first or second chapter of the book, where Peter Templar, I think it is, has gone to the city and at least claims to have, uh, you know, gone with a prostitute, and they're all like, well,
Yeah, yeah, that was a
It
great.
reminds me of that Monty Python skit where the Eric Idle is playing the guy who's doing the wink wink nudge nudge,
Yeah,
and the
wink,
and
wink,
the
nudge,
and
nudge.
the culmination, the punchline of that whole skit is when he finally, he's been leering and suggestive and all that, and the other guy is turned off by it all. Eric Idle says, you've been with a lady.
A
What's it
lady.
like?
Yeah, wink, wink.
Wink wink nudge nudge. Yeah, that's right. Keith?
Uh, I I don't think that I don't, and it may say something about me, but I don't find Pole's sort of attitude in these discussions, or Jenkins' attitude, um, particularly worrying. Yes, it's not the sort of attitude we would want today, but think about society when that he's placing the book in the sort of mid-30s. Very different society, very much male orientated. However well balanced or not you were, and Pole was certainly susceptible to women. That is fairly clear from a lot of the memoirs and so on. So yes, I can understand why modern readers get a little bit upset about it. I don't find it a problem, but then that says something about me, maybe, but it also says a lot about society, at the time, both at the time the book is set and at the time still when the book is written, because remember, this is still written in the sort of somewhere around 1960. I mean, I can't remember exactly. And we're not really past the Lady Chatterley trial, or not much. So things aren't loosening up all that much.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, I mean,
just for me
and one
personally,
of
let
the
me make
things
it
I always
clear.
say,
I'm not suggesting, I don't raise that question because I believe we need to retrofit today's attitudes onto yesterday's authors, but it's simply understanding that is, I think across the series as a whole, one of the features that characterizes the series is that in many of the chapters, there are kind of like extended discussions by one of the
mm,
characters.
mm,
One of the character tells a story or relates a situation. And I think overwhelmingly, those are male characters who do that. There are
sure,
relatively few cases where it's a female character who goes
sure,
on at length um, in the same manner. But
yeah,
that's
but
just an
that again,
observation.
that is society. And remember, one of the things that I've said for a long time, and I know there are a number of academics around who have also said this, and that is dance as a whole is a wonderful piece of social history. It's giving us, a look at all of society and the way No, all right, the upper echelons of society, let's be fair, in general, the upper echelons of society, from 1914 to, 1970. Yes, I agree. Pole was shipped off to prep school and then eaten, fairly young. That's normal. It's still pretty common. And, my wife has said this before now, that, public school does a lot of damage to boys.
Okay.
It really can do a lot of damage,
Right.
mentally.
Let's get Chris and then John.
Thanks. The 2 points I wanted to bring up is, while we don't hear a whole lot vis-a-vis Nick and Isabel's marriage per se, we are introduced and we hear a whole lot about the Tolmans, Isabel's family. I mean, and they're a big family, so there are many, many characters that start to populate the landscape from Isabel's family, and a lot of them very interesting, which I think is great. The other thing is, Brad, you shared that article about is Anthony Powell a snob? And that was contemporary to the publication of the book, which was 1960. And I was thinking about that. And so at the same time as Powell is publishing, something about what went on in the 1930s to a certain strata or class of people, you've also got people like Alan Silito out there doing Saturday Night and Sunday Morning and Loneliness of a Long Distance Runner, and that whole like kitchen sink lower classes type of thing that people were really like latching onto at the time. So I can understand where like critics would be like, oh yeah, here he comes again with his 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 1930s upper class stuff. So I can see where that didn't fit in with a lot of critics at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Pohl and Waugh and others of their period, even C.P. Snow, one could argue, were, they were in stark contrast to the angry young men, working class voice that was becoming more and more prevalent in English literature. But I mean, to me, I take that headline as simply typical Daily Mail behavior of trying to catch the reader in a glance, because they've made their fortune on that for sure. John and then Leslie.
Yeah, it's going back a little bit, but talking about the slightly cold attitude towards miscarriage and so on, I think that there had to be a sort of stoicism. I mean, in fact, I think that possibly we're going, the survival rates are actually sort of plunging or going down, at least for the first time for nearly a century. But my wife does quite a lot of sort of genealogy, and when she looks back, the infant deaths and deaths, say up to the age of 6 or something like that, are in multitudes really within her family and mine, and of course miscarriages weren't recorded, but those, it's only really now that these are being put onto our sort of knowledge family tree. They weren't really talked about at the time. It was your great grandfather had 3 brothers. No, he didn't. He had 4. One died, and he had a sister that died. But one only finds that out now. At the time, that was sort of, in a way, I think there was much more of it, and therefore it had to be kept, not hidden, but not dwelt on.
Right. Well, and there's also the very simple reality that there are many painful issues that in families struggle to talk about.
Yeah.
We don't have the we don't have the models of discussions about things like that, and certainly in those times, even more so. Leslie. You're still on mute.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. Thinking of other literary trends around the 1960s, I think, and thinking of these issues of the womanly side of life, reproduction, etc. There's an awful lot of that going on in literature at the time. This is when you've got a lot of women writing about female experience. You've got the L-shaped room, you've got the pumpkin eater, you've got all these sort of you've got The Taste of Honey. That's a play rather than a novel, but it's also a very well-known movie. So you've got all these things happening as well, and that's also part of the contemporary context in which Powell's work is appearing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but I mean, whether
Just
he's
one
actually
other.
aware of that kind of, I mean, is he kind of reviewing that kind of thing, or is that not on his radar at all?
That's a good question. I haven't read the collections of Paul's reviews, but one could probably learn something from. I assume that he, just had the process like the typical reviewers of those days. They were publishing weekly reviews of 5 to 6 books, churning through
Yeah.
mountains of reading material. So let's get Guy. Have you got your hand raised?
Yeah, the thing that struck me about this novel when I was first reading it and rereading it is, to me, it's the funniest one so far. Despite the darkness later on with McClintock, I love all the interactions with the musicians and artists, and the encounter with Lady Warminster, who's one of my favorite characters, and she's only really in this novel. I think her encounter with St. John is hilarious, and it was also the one where I realized when I was first reading the sequence is that I sort of gave up. I realized that not everything was going to be resolved, and I guessed that not everything was going to be resolved, and I started enjoying it from that perspective. And generally, also, I like other novels where not much happens or things drag on and you're expecting something to be resolved and it isn't. But it was this novel, when I was first reading it, that it struck me that's the way it was going to go, and all the better for it.
Right, right. Frank, you had a comment?
I actually thought this was the saddest book so far, and there were honestly there was a few moments that I thought were brilliant. In fact, when Roddy Cutts returns and his style of politics was described, I thought that's the funniest thing that's been in the series so far. But apart from that, I wanted a little bit more Widmer-Paul, a little more whimsy, but it was still very, very enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the most Widmer-Paul free book in the series in that regard. So we might have to take a little poll about who's on the camp sad and who's on the camp funny regarding Casanova's Chinese restaurant. Nick Burns, you have a comment? You're still on mute.
Yes, I'm okay. Thank you.
Great.
A couple of comments. One is the friendship with Moorland, and we have seen Dick Jenkins have friends before, and his friendship with Stringham, although always a reference point, has kind of waned. But Moorland is really his closest friendship, and absent in the book is to establish that friendship with Moorland, and then of course they're both in at once in the next book in the Stour Water scene. So I think that's a very interesting aspect of the book. Also, I just taught D.H. Lawrence's Women in Love And in that book, there's a character named Julius Halliday, who is also a fictionalization of Peter Warlock, aka Philip Heseltine, as McClintock is in this book. And it's very interesting knowing Casanova's Chinese restaurant so well and then teaching women in love. The portraits are so different. And of course, Lawrence is writing about Heseltine at a, but you do see in both portraits an essential sadness. And McClintock and his suicide are one of the bleakest parts of the entire sequence. And some of the reviews that you said around, which were very interesting to read, but really missed the pathos and even trauma of McClintock, which has always hit me very powerfully.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all three. I mean, Moreland mentions that both he and Gossage, are just recoil and have difficulty. Just the horrifying scene of finding McClintock dead,
Yes.
and having committed suicide, is was it is among the most powerfully. I mean, it's all secondhand. I mean, like much of the content of the book, it's
Yeah.
a secondhand narrative that's recalled by Nick Jenkins, but
Yeah.
it still resonates strongly, and particularly where it comes in the course of the book.
Yeah,
Frank?
and that's of course a very classical device to have the story of the death be told by the messenger, the story of the suicide of the king is told by the messenger in Greek drama and so on. And Pohl is adapting that to novelistic discourse very, very well. That's a good point.
Right. Yeah, good point. Frank?
I realize we're coming towards the end, and you teased us earlier on, Brad, with a discussion about the title. And I don't want to miss out on that because that's something I'm particularly interested in hearing about.
I'm clueless on that. It seems quite out of keeping with everything, all the other titles of the, or sort of like, classically referenced or from poetry or something like that. Whereas this one, I haven't a clue. So I'd be happy to hear if anyone else has an idea why that.
Was it some sort of sponsorship deal that he had with a Chinese restaurant that he was particularly fond of?
I think we do know. I can't remember. I think we do know. But of course, Bowles' conceit is the merger of these two restaurants,
Right.
which is it's the beginning of the book, but it's also brought back at the end of the book as part of the scene setting.
Well, it sort of reinforces the
but
hodgepodgey nature of the artistic community that he kind of engages with. Nick encounters through Moreland and McClintock, and of course Barnby is mentioned as a painter early on. Sally?
Well, I was just going to say that it's bohemian,
Yeah, right.
and it's the opposite of being a snob, really. I mean, and also to go back to about that snob thing, McClintock was absolutely broke. So Pohl does write about people who are broke, down and out, homeless. It's not just living in crumbling stately mansions.
Right, right.
Also, I'm on Camp Sad, by the way. I thought it was the most tragic book yet. So
Yeah.
not funny. Anyway.
No, and there are more deaths to come in the bigger scheme of the war coming up. Chris?
Well, as you just said, as we go through the book, I mean, what's happening here? The characters are, aging, and over the course of someone's life, think about it, you're going to lose some people very young. You're going to lose some of your friends, in the middle somewhere. Not everybody's going to make it to, 80 and up. So there's always, and early on, so this is the 1930s and things. So they're young, they're in their late 20s, early 30s, that kind of thing. That's heavy. I mean, that's really heavy.
Right.
It's not something that's happened too often yet. Further up the road, it's kind of like, oh yeah, that guy, yeah, I remember. But his like circle of friends here, of course, he's kind of like, as everyone does. And this is what I love about this series of books is like, these are the things that happen to everyone. So he had his friends in school. He had his friends kind of after school, and now he has his business, and like then now his social friends, which are totally different from, you know, people like Templar and Stringer and those people. But these are the kind of people he gravitates to, the theatrical and the literary people, you know, arts and leisure, the arts and leisure type people. But yeah, so I mean, and that happens with, I think, everyone.
I think it's interesting, and maybe Nick Burns can chime in here with perspective, but in the overall design of the series, one thing that I find interesting about this book in particular is, first of all, from a time standpoint, it starts essentially jumping back quite a ways, not so much as like the kindly ones having a jump back to before the First World War, but is essentially the Bohemian community. So premier the friendship with Moreland, the acquaintance with McClintock, with Norman Chandler, and others, is sort of something that you don't see that coming earlier in the earlier books, do you? And I just wonder, in terms of Pohl deciding how he worked that in, picking this book to put that, to kind of introduce that aspect of Nick Jenkins' world where we haven't really seen much of it. We've seen little hints of it with Mr. Deacon and Barnby, but you know, it hasn't really been as much to the forefront as it is in this particular book. So I just find it interesting. It's almost as if he kind of said, "Oh, wait a sec, I gotta make sure I don't lose this bit because I've got to work it into my pattern." I just wonder whether or not that was something he saw up front, or it just kind of emerged as, say, with volume 3 or 4, that he needed to address those things, or wanted to introduce those aspects of Nick Jenkins' world. Keith, a comment?
You raised the question of flashback. The thing that struck me reading this was the whole book is full of, you know, interesting little flashbacks and flash forwards. They're all over the place. You know, the Mortimer at the beginning, yeah, we're seeing the bombed out pub. He then goes back and he's talking about, you know, actually being there. And, you know, there's flash forward and flash back, even in that first chapter about
absolutely.
the Mortimer. And it's lots.
It leaps.
It's not a
leaps
big
ahead
flashback.
4 volumes.
Yeah.
In terms of timeline,
yeah,
it jumps.
But my point is, it's not a big flashback, like the one we will see in the next volume. It's lots of little ones, little flashbacks, little flash forwards, which are just, sort of pinned in to a paragraph.
Right. Ashley?
Hi. You know, you had commented that we might not have seen coming the friendships he forms with the Bohemians, with the artists. And so I wanted to just comment on that and say that Moreland reminds me a great deal of Charles Stringham in the wittiness and verbosity of his conversation. And so I thought that that might be a link to his you know, so we somehow might see Moreland coming in a way through Stringham. And Stringham is someone who fairly early on we learn is conversant in poetry, and when we see him at the very end in the later books. I'm not sure if we're allowed in this group to talk about later books. Is that okay? Because I admit
There's no spoiler police in
yeah,
this
okay,
group.
okay. But
Please, please, let's not go down that path.
But he talks about poetry. So there's that artistic link in a way, and he's someone who is really thwarted. So in a way, it's almost as if Moreland perhaps is a sort of continuation of the Stringham who might have been.
That's an interesting,
Just a
thought.
thought.
I mean, Stringham's presence at the party is actually one of the nicest and most interesting. He reminds us of, to some extent, actually, he's more of a character there in control of himself and his presentation than he is, for example, when he shows up at the old boys' dinner, and he is quite, he's pretty much out of it.
Right.
It's his lines in that scene are some of the best lines in the book, I think.
Absolutely.
Character,
It's such a funny scene with him.
Right.
McClintock.
One other thing I just wanted to throw out is an observation which didn't really come to me until this reread is this is the volume, it seems to me, where Pohl most directly introduces and acknowledges the gay characters in the dance. Norman Chandler, much more explicit suggestion that Mr. Deacon is gay. I mean, it's very slighting in the earlier volume where we talk about, why does he have to go off to France? Well, I think we now know why he had to run off to France. I just thought that was it was something I hadn't really tuned into, but there is certainly more of a direct, particularly in the time frame that it was still, at that point illegal. Male homosexual relationships were illegal in the UK until what, about 63? And but that's I mean, it was certainly, you can't, it was inherent in the makeup, the demographics of the society that Pohl was in, that gay men and women were going to be part of it. Leslie, a comment?
I was going to say, this is actually possibly a historical artifact of the fact this is after the Wolfenden Committee, which had, against everybody's expectations, actually recommended decriminalizing homosexuality, and had led to the setting up of things like initiatives for homosexual law reform. And I think I think there had been, by 1960, I'd actually have to look this up. I think there had already been attempts to bring parliamentary bills. I mean, it didn't actually happen until 1967, but the pendulum was swinging.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a general, I think there was a general wider societal feeling. I've been reading this absolutely fascinating anthology called Some Men in London, which is just
The Peter Porter books.
Extracts from contemporary documents. You can just see that people are feeling that things are just beginning. I mean, there's an awful lot of, people who are suffering and people who have got absolutely awful attitudes, in the police and the high court judges and so on, with absolutely shocking attitudes. But you've also got people who are pressing for reform, people who are expressing new opinions. So I think 1960 is, I think, when even if it is before it actually is the year of the Chatterley trial, so it is, things are, there is a general sense of things changing generally.
Well, and certainly in terms of how gay characters are addressed in the book, I mean, Nick Jenkins is for the time quite unjudgmental
Yeah.
in his description, even as other characters will be a little bit more arch in their
Yeah.
reference to Norman Chandler as an example, or Max
Yeah.
Pilgrim. Nick kind of just, I mean, to his credit, considering the time, he neither camps it up nor disparages it. It's simply a fact of life.
He was at Eton. I mean, I mean, there's a whole hinterland there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're coming up to the end of the hour. Let me just mention that for next month, we have we're going to be talking about The Kindly Ones, which is a wonderful novel for many reasons. We get to see General Conyers again, which I'm happy to, one of my favorite characters. And we're going to have as our guest Wesley Stace, who has had a successful musical career under several different names, but also is a fantastic Powell fan, and taught a class, and in fact during lockdown that some of you probably got introduced to the dance through Wesley's class. And of course, I welcome anybody, if you have issues that stuff you would like to see shared. I try to keep the traffic to a minimum on the site because we all have more email than we're ready to go through. But if there's something in particular, I did share the two articles, especially this month, because I thought they were both likely to be of interest to the group as a whole. Chris, you have a comment?
First, thank you for sharing those articles because they were really good. And secondly, I did take the Rosenbach Library class on Anthony Powell's dance with Wesley Stace, which is why I'm here today. And I have to say, he is a great instructor. He really brings it to life for everyone. So don't miss next month. Don't sleep.
Okay. Thank you for that feature, scenes from coming attractions. Let's sell these things. So if there are any final comments before we wrap up, good discussion this week. I think it's great to have the contributions from all the different perspectives. A couple of things came up in the chat I'm afraid we didn't get a chance to talk to, but pointing out Matilda Matilda does get a chance to speak at some length, and I also Mrs. McClintock gets to speak her piece or the lack thereof at some length, and reminded me in some ways Nick's reception of her, even though it's typically hands off from a Powellian standpoint. He's not averse to probably one of the most tenacious prejudices that exists among the male gender, which is against angry women. Many men struggle to deal with angry women well, and Hilda McClintock is certainly one heck of an angry woman. Okay, any other comments before we wrap up? If not, we will see you next month with our special guest. And thanks for taking part. These are great discussions, and I hope to see you all again next month.
Thank you.